Sarah's seemingly perfect marriage shatters when she uncovers her husband Daniel's affair with his assistant, Emma, and his web of lies, including financial misdeeds that threaten their future. As Sarah pieces together the betrayal, she faces manipulation, public humiliation, and Daniel's attempts to blame her for his downfall. The story dives into themes of infidelity, deceit, and power struggles, exposing the devastating consequences of betrayal, while keeping viewers on edge. As tensions rise, audiences are left seething with anger, as Sarah battles to reclaim her life and confront the man who destroyed her trust. It was the summer of 2016, in the charming coastal town of Avalon Bay, where the smell of salt water and freshly baked pastries from the corner cafe filled the air. Nestled between sandy beaches and towering cliffs was the home of Sarah and Daniel Carter. On the surface, their life looked like something straight out of a magazine. A modern two-story house, 2 luxury cars in the driveway, and a golden retriever named Max lounging in the yard. They were the town's picture-perfect couple, or so it seemed. Sarah, a 34-year-old interior designer, with an eye for detail, had built a reputation for transforming bland spaces into works of art. Her clients adored her, and her social media was filled with glimpses of her perfectly curated life. She always looked effortlessly chic, with her wavy brown hair, signature pearl earrings, and a smile that lit up every room she entered. But beneath her polished exterior, Sarah harbored doubts, questions about her marriage that she'd long buried under her busy schedule. Daniel, her husband of 9 years, was Avalon Bay's golden boy. At 36, he was a successful real estate developer who could sell a house with nothing more than his confident grin. With his neatly trimmed beard, tailored suits, and charm to spare, Daniel was the kind of guy everyone trusted. He could sell ice to an Eskimo, Sarah's best friend Rachel used to joke. But lately, that charisma felt like a mask, one Sarah wasn't sure she could see through anymore. Their relationship wasn't always this strained. In the early years, they were inseparable, spending long weekends exploring hiking trails and sharing late-night talks about their dreams. But as their careers took off, the closeness faded. Sarah spent her days juggling demanding clients, while Daniel's work required constant travel and late-night meetings. When they were together, the conversations were polite but distant, as though they were actors playing their roles instead of partners sharing a life. It all began with a single, out-of-place moment. It was a Friday evening in June, and the couple had invited friends over for dinner. Sarah had spent the day preparing a feast: roasted salmon, a colorful quinoa salad, and her famous lemon tart for dessert. By the time the guests arrived, the house smelled like heaven, and laughter filled the air as wine glasses clinked. Everything seemed perfect. But then Sarah noticed something, or rather someone. Among the guests was Emma, Daniel's new assistant. She was young, with striking auburn hair, and a laugh that seemed a little too loud for the occasion. Daniel introduced her with the casual ease of someone who wasn't trying to hide anything. But Sarah couldn't shake the way Emma's eyes lingered on her husband just a second too long. At first, Sarah brushed it off. "You're imagining things," she told herself as she refilled her glass of Chardonnay. But as the night went on, little details began to add up. The way Emma seemed to hang on Daniel's every word. The way Daniel's smile was just a touch brighter when he looked at her. And then, there was the moment when Sarah walked into the kitchen to find the two of them laughing over some private joke. They stopped the second she entered, their smiles faltering like kids caught sneaking candy. By the next morning, the seed of doubt had taken root. Sarah couldn't let it go. As she cleaned up the remnants of the dinner party, she replayed every interaction in her mind. "You're being paranoid," she muttered, stacking plates in the dishwasher. But the uneasy feeling lingered, gnawing at her like a splinter she couldn't reach. It didn't help that Daniel seemed oblivious to her mood. He breezed through the weekend, answering work emails and talking about an upcoming property deal. When Sarah finally brought up Emma, he waved it off. "Emma." "She's harmless," he said, not even looking up from his laptop. "You don't have to worry about her." But that wasn't what Sarah had asked. She didn't say she was worried, just curious, and Daniel's defensiveness only made her more suspicious. The first real crack in their perfect life appeared a week later. Sarah was at her studio, finalizing mood boards for a client, when her phone buzzed with a text from Rachel. "Hey, thought you might want to see this?" Attached was a photo taken at a downtown cafe. A candid shot of Daniel sitting at a table with Emma. They were leaning in close, their heads almost touching, and Daniel's hand rested casually on the back of her chair. Sarah's stomach dropped. The photo wasn't damning on its own. Colleagues could meet for coffee after all. But it was the intimacy of their body language that struck her. Daniel looked relaxed, almost too comfortable, and Emma's expression was one of admiration. That night, Sarah confronted him. "Were you with Emma today?" she asked, keeping her voice calm, even as her heart pounded. Daniel didn't miss a beat. "Yeah, we had a meeting." "Why?" He seemed more confused than guilty, but Sarah wasn't convinced. When she mentioned the photo, his face darkened. "Are you spying on me now?" he asked, his tone sharp. "It wasn't me," Sarah shot back. "Rachel saw you. Why didn't you tell me?" "I didn't think I needed to report my every move," Daniel snapped. "She's my assistant, Sarah. That's it." The argument spiraled from there, turning into a heated back and forth about trust, boundaries, and the growing distance between them. By the end of it, Sarah was left feeling more confused than ever. Was she overreacting, or was there something Daniel wasn't telling her? As the weeks went by, the tension only grew. Daniel's schedule became even busier, and his excuses for late nights and weekend meetings felt flimsy at best. Sarah began noticing small changes, like how he suddenly paid more attention to his appearance, or how he kept his phone glued to his side, even taking it into the bathroom. When she asked him about it, he brushed her off with a laugh. "Work's been hectic," he said. "You know how it is." But Sarah didn't know how it was. Not anymore. The man she'd married, the one who used to share everything with her, now felt like a stranger. One evening, after Daniel had left for yet another business dinner, Sarah found herself pacing the living room, her mind racing. Max, their ever-faithful golden retriever, watched her with concerned eyes as she debated what to do. She knew she couldn't go on like this, second-guessing everything and feeling like an outsider in her own marriage. And so, Sarah made a decision. She would find out the truth, no matter what it took. Over the next few days, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The doubts that had taken root after the dinner party were growing into a full-blown obsession. She found herself scrutinizing every interaction, every word, and every moment she and Daniel shared. And the more she looked, the less she liked what she saw. It started small. One evening, Sarah noticed a faint trace of perfume on Daniel's shirt, one that wasn't hers. When she asked about it, he laughed it off, saying it must have been from someone he brushed past at work. Then there were the mysterious text messages that made his phone buzz late at night. "It's just work," he'd say, tucking his phone out of sight before she could ask more questions. It was like he had an endless supply of excuses, and each one made Sarah trust him a little less. But it wasn't just Daniel's behavior that raised red flags. Emma, his assistant, started popping up in Sarah's life in unexpected ways. One afternoon, Sarah was running errands when she spotted Emma at the local farmer's market. She was chatting with the vendor, her arms full of flowers, when she noticed Sarah. For a moment, Emma's smile faltered, replaced by something that almost looked like guilt. Then, just as quickly, her bright demeanor returned. "Sarah, so nice to see you," she said, waving like they were old friends. Sarah forced a smile and exchanged pleasantries, but her gut told her there was more to Emma than met the eye. That night, as she lay in bed next to Daniel, who was scrolling through his phone with a smug smile, Sarah made up her mind. She needed answers, and if Daniel wasn't going to give them to her, she'd find them herself. The next morning, while Daniel was in the shower, Sarah did something she never thought she'd do. She unlocked his phone. Her hands shook as she scrolled through his messages, searching for anything that might confirm her suspicions. Most of the texts were mundane, work updates, group chats with colleagues, but then she saw it. A message thread with Emma. At first, the text seemed innocent enough. They talked about meetings, deadlines, and client pitches, but then Sarah saw a message that made her blood run cold. "Last night was amazing. Can't wait to see you again." It was from Emma, and it was sent just 2 days ago. Sarah barely had time to process what she'd read before she heard the water shut off. Heart pounding, she locked the phone and placed it back on the nightstand. When Daniel stepped out of the bathroom, towel wrapped around his waist, Sarah forced a smile. "I'm heading out for coffee," she said, grabbing her bag and keys. She needed to get out of the house before she said something she couldn't take back. At the cafe, Sarah stared at her untouched latte, replaying the message over and over in her mind. Last night was amazing. What did it mean? Were they just meeting for drinks, or was it something more? And if Daniel really was cheating, how long had it been going on? She felt sick to her stomach, torn between confronting him and pretending she hadn't seen anything. It was Rachel who finally snapped her out of it. When Sarah told her best friend about the message, Rachel didn't mince words. "You need proof," she said, her voice low but firm. "If you confront him now, he'll just deny it. You need something he can't talk his way out of." That night, Sarah started digging deeper. She checked Daniel's emails, his calendar, even his credit card statements. What she found only fueled her suspicions. There were receipts for expensive dinners she hadn't been invited to, late-night Uber rides to addresses she didn't recognize, and, most damning of all, a charge for a luxury hotel just outside of town. The date matched the night Emma sent that message, but Sarah didn't stop there. She started paying closer attention to Daniel's habits, noting when he left the house, and when he returned. She even drove past the hotel one evening, just to see if his car was there. It wasn't, but that didn't ease her mind. If anything, it made her more determined to uncover the truth. One Friday evening, Sarah got her chance. Daniel had told her he'd be working late on a project, but Sarah knew better. She waited until he left the house, then followed him, keeping a safe distance so he wouldn't notice her. Sure enough, he drove straight to the hotel. Sarah parked across the street, her heart racing as she watched him walk inside. She debated whether to follow him or stay in the car, but before she could decide, her phone buzzed. It was a text from Rachel. "Don't do anything crazy. Just get what you need and leave." Sarah took a deep breath, then grabbed her phone and stepped out of the car. Inside the hotel, she spotted Daniel almost immediately. He was at the bar, talking to Emma. They were sitting close, too close, and laughing like they didn't have a care in the world. Sarah pulled out her phone and snapped a photo, her hands shaking as she tried to keep it steady. It wasn't much, but it was enough to prove that Daniel hadn't been honest with her. As she walked back to her car, Sarah felt a mix of emotions: anger, sadness, betrayal. She'd suspected for weeks that something was going on, but seeing it with her own eyes made it real in a way she wasn't prepared for. Part of her wanted to march back inside and confront them both, but she knew that wouldn't solve anything. She needed to be smart about this, calculated even. If Daniel thought he could play her for a fool, he was in for a rude awakening. When Sarah got home, she started putting her plan into motion. She saved the photo to a hidden folder on her phone and made a list of everything she'd found so far: the messages, the receipts, the hotel charge. It wasn't just about proving Daniel was cheating, it was about protecting herself. If their marriage ended, she wanted to make sure she had the upper hand. Over the next week, Sarah kept up the act. She smiled when Daniel came home, laughed at his jokes, and pretended everything was fine. But inside, she was seething. Every time he kissed her goodbye or told her he loved her, she wanted to scream. How could he lie to her so easily? How could he look her in the eye and act like nothing was wrong? Then, one night, Daniel slipped up. It was a small thing, a comment about a work dinner that didn't line up with what Sarah knew. But it was enough to confirm her suspicions. When she pressed him on it, he stumbled over his words, trying to backtrack. "I must have gotten the dates mixed up," he said, avoiding her gaze. Sarah didn't buy it. She knew the truth, even if Daniel wasn't ready to admit it, and now she had everything she needed to confront him. But Sarah wasn't just going to confront Daniel. She was going to make him face the consequences of his actions, no matter how painful it was for both of them. Sarah didn't sleep that night. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, as the quiet hum of Daniel's breathing filled the room. His phone was back on the nightstand, face down, as if mocking her. Each vibration that buzzed through the wood felt like a blow, and with every passing second, Sarah's anger bubbled closer to the surface. By morning, the storm inside her had settled into a cold determination. Daniel left early for a client breakfast, pressing a quick kiss on Sarah's cheek without noticing her stiffened posture. The moment his car disappeared down the street, Sarah sprang into action. She pulled out the folder where she had stored every shred of evidence: photos, receipts, Text screenshots. She'd spent weeks gathering this, connecting the dots piece by piece. Now, there was no denying what she had. And today was the day she was going to confront him. But first, she needed to know how far this had gone. Sarah grabbed her keys, a coffee to go, and set out on her mission. If Daniel had been careless enough to leave crumbs, there were bound to be more. She stopped by his office under the guise of dropping off lunch, something she hadn't done in years. The receptionist smiled politely, clearly surprised to see her. "Oh, Daniel's not here today," she said. "He called in earlier and said he was working remotely." Sarah froze. Remotely liar. Her suspicions intensified, but she kept her smile polite. "Of course I'll just drop this off for him. Can you leave it in his office?" "Absolutely." She handed over the bag and walked out, her heart pounding. If he wasn't at work, where was he? Sarah sat in her car, gripping the steering wheel. She wanted to scream, but instead, she took a deep breath and pulled out her phone. She opened the Find My iPhone app. It was a risk, one she wasn't proud of, but Daniel had once given her access years ago in case of emergencies. He probably didn't even remember. Now, it felt like her last resort. The little blue dot that represented Daniel's phone appeared a few seconds later, and it wasn't at home. It wasn't anywhere near his office. It was at the Harbor Inn, a boutique hotel on the edge of town. Sarah sat in her car across from the hotel, her hands shaking on the steering wheel. She felt like a character in a movie, the kind who always made the terrible choice to investigate when they should just walk away. But she couldn't leave. She had to know. For a full 15 minutes she waited, staring at the entrance, as her pulse thundered in her ears. Then she saw him. Daniel walked out of the hotel, with Emma beside him, both of them laughing. Like they didn't have a care in the world. Emma's hand brushed his arm as they lingered near his car, and Sarah watched as Daniel turned toward her with that same charming grin he'd once saved just for Sarah. Something inside her broke. She grabbed her phone and snapped a series of photos through the windshield. They weren't perfect, but they were good enough. Good enough to show the truth. Daniel opened the car door for Emma like some chivalrous gentleman, and as they drove away, Sarah felt tears sting her eyes. She had her proof. But now came the hard part. That evening, Sarah prepared dinner like nothing had happened. The house smelled of rosemary and garlic, the kind of meal she used to make when things were good between them. Max curled up at her feet, his tail thumping softly as she set the table. She heard Daniel's car pull into the driveway, and a moment later, he walked through the front door, looking as polished as ever. "Something smells great," he said, leaning down to kiss her cheek. Sarah flinched before she could stop herself. Daniel noticed but didn't comment. As they sat down to eat, Sarah studied him, memorizing every detail. The way he loosened his tie, the faint smugness in his smile as he talked about his busy day. She almost admired how effortless his lies came now. Almost. "Big meeting today?" she asked casually, sipping her wine. "Yeah. It went longer than I expected," Daniel replied, cutting into his steak. "The client was picky, but I smoothed it over." Sarah felt her grip tighten on the glass. "And you weren't at the office?" Daniel froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. "What do you mean?" "I stopped by today," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the fire in her chest. "Your receptionist said you weren't there, said you were working remotely." Daniel hesitated for half a second before recovering. "I had a client meeting at a cafe," he said smoothly. "No big deal." Sarah stared at him, her expression unreadable. "Funny, I could have sworn I saw your car at the Harbor Inn." This time, Daniel's smile faltered. It was subtle, just a flicker of uncertainty, but Sarah caught it. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. "You don't?" Sarah set her wineglass down, her movements slow and deliberate. "Because I know exactly what you were doing today. Daniel and I know who you were with." For the first time in weeks, Daniel looked genuinely rattled. "Sarah? Don't lie to me." Her voice was sharp now, cutting through his excuses before they could even form. "I followed you. I saw you leave the hotel with Emma. I saw everything." The room fell silent. Daniel opened his mouth, but no words came out. The charming, confident man who could talk his way out of anything suddenly had nothing to say. Sarah stood, pulling the folder of evidence from the drawer she'd hidden it in. She tossed it onto the table in front of him. "Go ahead. Take a look. There's no getting out of this, Daniel. Not this time." Daniel flipped open the folder, his face paling as he saw the photos, the texts, the receipts. He stared at the proof of his betrayal, and for once, he looked small, defeated. "How long?" Sarah asked, her voice quieter now. "How long has this been going on?" Daniel swallowed hard, his eyes darting between her and the evidence. "A few months," he admitted finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "It didn't mean anything. Sarah, I swear I made a mistake." Sarah let out a bitter laugh. "A mistake? That's what you're calling it?" "I love you," Daniel said, his voice breaking. "It was stupid, and I'll do whatever it takes to fix this." "You don't get to say that." Sarah's voice trembled with anger. "You don't get to sit there and pretend you care about me while you've been sneaking around behind my back." "I'll end it," Daniel pleaded. "I'll cut her out of my life. We can fix this, Sarah, please." Sarah stared at him, her heart aching at the desperation in his voice. But then she remembered the way he had smiled at Emma, the way he had lied to her face for months, and any sympathy she felt dissolved. "You don't get to decide what happens next," she said. "Not anymore." Daniel blinked, looking up at her as if he didn't recognize the woman standing in front of him. "What does that mean?" "It means I'm done," Sarah said firmly. "I'm done with your lies, your excuses, and your betrayals. You don't deserve me, Daniel. You never did." For a long moment, neither of them said anything. Then, slowly, Daniel stood, his expression hardening. "You're throwing this away over a mistake," he said, his voice cold now. "I hope you're happy." "I will be," Sarah shot back, meeting his gaze without flinching. "And one day, you'll realize what you lost." Daniel grabbed his keys and stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him. The sound echoed through the empty rooms, and for the first time in weeks, Sarah felt like she could finally breathe. She sank into a chair, tears slipping down her cheeks as Max came to rest his head in her lap. It wasn't the ending she'd imagined for herself, but it was better than living a lie. Sarah wiped her eyes and looked at the folder on the table she'd spent so much time gathering evidence, but now she didn't need it. She knew the truth, and that was enough. As the sun set outside, Sarah realized something. She wasn't broken, she wasn't weak, she had faced the truth head-on, and she had survived. And from now on, she was going to live life on her own terms. Sarah spent the next few days in a strange limbo. Daniel hadn't come home since the confrontation, and she didn't bother reaching out to him. Instead, she threw herself into work, determined to keep her mind occupied. But no amount of color swatches or design plans could silence the whirlwind of emotions that consumed her: anger, heartbreak, betrayal, and, most of all, a simmering desire for closure. She knew this wasn't over. Not yet. Then, late one evening, her phone buzzed with a text from Rachel. "You're not going to believe this." Attached was a photo, blurry but unmistakable Daniel and Emma, sitting together at an upscale restaurant in town, their heads close as they shared a private laugh. Sarah stared at the screen, her hands trembling. She felt like she was back at square one, the initial sting of betrayal hitting her all over again. After everything, Daniel hadn't even tried to make things right. Instead, he'd doubled down on his lies, parading around town with Emma like nothing had happened. And that was the moment Sarah decided she was done playing the victim. The next morning, Sarah woke up with a clarity she hadn't felt in weeks. She spent hours on the phone, making arrangements and pulling strings, all while maintaining a calm, professional demeanor. By noon, she had everything she needed. Her first call was to Emma. "Hi, Emma," Sarah said when the younger woman answered, her tone cool but polite. "It's Sarah. I think we need to talk." There was a pause, and Sarah could almost hear the panic on the other end of the line. Hi, Sarah, I don't know what you mean." "Oh, I think you do," Sarah replied, her voice as sharp as glass. "I know about you and Daniel, and I know you've been sneaking around behind my back for months." Emma stammered, trying to deny it, but Sarah didn't let her get far. "Save it," she said. "I'm not interested in your excuses. I just thought you should know that whatever fantasy you've built up in your head about him, it's about to come crashing down." With that, Sarah hung up. Her next call was to Daniel's business partner, a no-nonsense woman named Claudia, who had been instrumental in helping Daniel grow his company. Sarah had always liked Claudia, and she knew she could count on her to handle things with discretion. "Claudia," Sarah began. "I need to tell you something about Daniel. Something that might impact the company." That evening, Sarah hosted a dinner party, a small, intimate gathering with a few close friends and family members. It was a last-minute event, but everyone was eager to support her, especially after hearing snippets of what she'd been through. The table was set beautifully, the wine was flowing, and for the first time in weeks, Sarah felt almost normal. But beneath the surface, she was a bundle of nerves, waiting for the moment she knew was coming. Right on cue, Daniel arrived. He walked through the door, looking disheveled, his tie loose and his expression wary. "What's going on?" he asked, glancing around at the gathered guests. "Sit down," Sarah said, gesturing to an empty chair at the head of the table. Daniel hesitated, clearly sensing that something was off, but he did as she asked, sitting stiffly as Sarah took her place across from him. "I thought it was time we had an honest conversation," she began, her voice calm but firm. "Not just about us, but about everything." Daniel shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting to the other guests. "Sarah, I don't think this is the right time." "Oh, I think it's the perfect time," Sarah interrupted. She pulled out the folder, the same one she'd shown him before, and placed it on the table. "This is everything, every lie, every betrayal, every secret you thought you could keep from me." Daniel's face turned pale as Sarah opened the folder, laying out the evidence piece by piece for everyone to see: the photos, the receipts, the text messages. It was all there, undeniable and damning. The room fell silent as the truth came crashing down around them. "I gave you a chance to come clean," Sarah said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I gave you every opportunity to make this right, and you threw it all away. So now, you get to deal with the consequences." Daniel looked around the room, his face a mix of anger and desperation. "This is private," he hissed. "You had no right to air our dirty laundry like this." "No right?" Sarah shot back, her eyes blazing. "You had no right to cheat on me. You had no right to lie to me and make me feel like I was losing my mind. You brought this on yourself, Daniel." The tension in the room was palpable, and for a moment it seemed like Daniel might try to fight back, but then he slumped in his chair, defeated. "I'm sorry," he muttered. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen." "It's too late for apologies," Sarah said, her voice steady. "I've already spoken to a lawyer and Claudia." Daniel's head snapped up at that, his eyes widening in shock. "Claudia?" "She knows everything," Sarah continued. "About the affair, about the money you've been funneling into that secret account. She's not happy, Daniel, and neither are your investors." Daniel's face went pale, and for the first time, Sarah saw real fear in his eyes. "I think it's time you left," she said, her voice cold. Without another word, Daniel stood and walked out, his shoulders slumped, as though the weight of his actions had finally caught up to him. As the door closed behind him, Sarah let out a shaky breath, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the table. "You okay?" Rachel asked, coming over to put a hand on her shoulder. Sarah nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. "Yeah," she said. "I think I will be." As the evening wound down, Sarah's friends and family rallied around her, offering their support and reminding her of her strength. It wasn't the ending she had imagined for herself, but it was a new beginning, one where she finally put herself first. When she finally climbed into bed that night, Sarah felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. Daniel was gone, but so was the weight of his betrayal. She had faced the truth, stood her ground, and taken back control of her life. And for the first time in weeks, she slept soundly. Sarah woke up the next morning with a weight lifted from her chest. The previous night's confrontation was playing in her mind like a vivid dream, but the reality was undeniable. She had stood her ground. Daniel's lies, his betrayal, his carefully constructed web of deceit. She had torn it apart in front of everyone who mattered. But she knew it wasn't over yet. Daniel's departure was just the beginning. His actions had ripple effects, and Sarah was determined to ensure that he faced the consequences of everything he had done. This wasn't about revenge, it was about reclaiming control. For too long, she had let herself feel powerless. Not anymore. Her first step, closing the chapter on their marriage for good. Later that afternoon, Sarah met with her lawyer, an experienced and sharp woman named Linda. The two sat across from each other in Linda's sleek office, the faint hum of traffic filtering through the windows. Sarah had come prepared. bringing every piece of evidence she had collected. Linda flipped through the folder, nodding occasionally as she examined the photos, text messages, and financial statements. "You've done your homework," she said, her tone approving. "With this, we have a strong case. I can ensure you'll get what you're entitled to. And then some." Sarah felt a surge of relief, but also a twinge of sadness. This wasn't the life she had envisioned when she said her vows all those years ago. "I just want to move on," she said quietly. "And you will," Linda assured her. "But first, we need to make sure you're protected. Daniel doesn't strike me as the type to go down without a fight." Sarah nodded, steeling herself. She was ready. Meanwhile, Daniel wasn't taking things lying down. In the days following the confrontation, he had been scrambling to contain the fallout. His relationship with Emma, if it could even be called that, was unraveling fast. The younger woman had been furious when Sarah called her out, accusing Daniel of dragging her into a mess she never wanted to be part of. "You said you were handling this," Emma hissed during a tense meeting at a cafe. "Now everyone knows, and I look like some homewrecker." Daniel tried to calm her down, but Emma wasn't having it. "Maybe you should have thought about that before you lied to both of us," she snapped, before storming out, leaving Daniel sitting alone at the table. And that was just the beginning of his problems. Claudia, his business partner, had wasted no time investigating the financial discrepancies Sarah had mentioned. What she found left her furious. "Care to explain this?" she demanded during a heated meeting at the office, throwing a stack of documents onto the table. The papers outlined the secret account Daniel had been funneling money into, an account he had kept hidden, even from her. Daniel's charm, the very thing that had carried him through life, was failing him now. No amount of smooth talking could undo the damage he had done. Back at home, Sarah was taking her next steps. With Linda's guidance, she had begun the process of filing for divorce. The paperwork was overwhelming at times, but every signature, every form she completed felt like a step closer to freedom. Her support system was stronger than ever. Rachel checked in daily, bringing over coffee and words of encouragement. "You're handling this like a pro," she said one evening, as the two of them sat on the couch, Max curled up between them. "I don't feel like a pro," Sarah admitted. "Half the time, I'm just trying to keep it together." "And you are," Rachel said firmly. "Don't forget that." Sarah smiled, grateful for her friend's unwavering support. The real turning point came a week later. Sarah received a call from Claudia, who had become an unexpected ally. "We need to meet," Claudia said. Her tone was serious, almost conspiratorial. The two women met at a quiet restaurant downtown. Away from prying eyes, Claudia didn't waste any time. "I thought you should know what Daniel's been up to," she said, sliding a folder across the table. Sarah opened it, her heart sinking as she saw the contents. The documents detailed not only Daniel's financial misdeeds, but also his efforts to cover them up. He had been using company funds to finance his lifestyle, and now that the truth was coming out, the business was at risk. "He's going to lose everything if this goes public," Claudia said. "And honestly, he deserves to, but I wanted to give you a heads up, in case this affects your divorce proceedings." Sarah felt a mix of emotions, anger, betrayal, and a strange sense of vindication. Daniel had always prided himself on his success, on the image he projected to the world now. That image was crumbling, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The final confrontation between Sarah and Daniel was inevitable. It happened on a rainy evening, the kind where the sky seemed to mirror the turmoil in Sarah's heart. Daniel showed up at the house unannounced, his clothes damp from the rain, and his expression a mix of desperation and defiance. "We need to talk," he said. Sarah crossed her arms, standing in the doorway. "There's nothing left to say." "Please," Daniel said, his voice cracking. "Just hear me out." Reluctantly, Sarah stepped aside, letting him in. The two of them sat in the living room, the tension between them almost suffocating. "I know I messed up," Daniel began, his voice low. "I know I hurt you, but I'm trying to fix it. I'm trying to make things right." Sarah laughed bitterly. "Fix it? You're only trying to fix it because you got caught. If I hadn't found out, you'd still be lying to me." Daniel looked down, unable to meet her gaze. "I don't want to lose you," he said finally. "You already have," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "You lost me the moment you decided I wasn't enough for you." Daniel flinched at her words, but he didn't argue. He knew she was right. "This is the end, Daniel," Sarah said, standing up. "I deserve better, and I'm done waiting for you to become the man I thought you were." Daniel nodded slowly, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "I'm sorry," he said again. But Sarah could tell he finally understood that his apologies weren't enough. As he walked out the door, Sarah felt a sense of finality. This chapter of her life was over, and while it hadn't ended the way she'd hoped, she knew she was stronger for it. The storm outside had subsided, leaving the air fresh and still. Sarah stood by the window, watching as Daniel's car disappeared into the distance. For the first time in a long time, she felt a glimmer of hope. This wasn't the life she had planned, but it was hers, and she was ready to embrace whatever came next. The days that followed were a whirlwind of revelations and growing tension. Sarah had thought she'd uncovered everything about Daniel's betrayal, but the truth had even more layers than she realized. She wasn't just dealing with a husband who had been unfaithful. She was dealing with a man who had built his life on lies. Sarah was in her home office when her lawyer Linda called. Her voice was calm but firm, the kind of tone that made you sit up straighter. "Sarah, we've hit a significant development," Linda began. "I've been digging into Daniel's financials, and it's worse than we initially thought." Sarah braced herself. "How much worse?" "There's evidence he's been hiding assets," Linda said. "Not just the secret account we already knew about. There are properties, offshore funds, even investments under fake business names. He's been funneling money away for years." For a moment, Sarah couldn't speak. Her mind raced with questions. How had she missed this? How could someone she had shared her life with for almost a decade hide something so massive? "I need to warn you," Linda continued. "Once we confront him with this, things could get ugly. Men like Daniel don't just roll over when they're cornered." Sarah's grip tightened on her phone. "I don't care how ugly it gets," she said firmly. "I want this over." Meanwhile, Daniel was unraveling his charm. The weapon that had carried him through so many tight spots was failing him. Emma had cut ties completely, refusing to take his calls or answer his texts. Claudia had informed him that their company's board was conducting an internal audit, and she made it clear that if she found anything, she wouldn't hesitate to report him. For the first time in years, Daniel realized he was losing control. His carefully curated image was slipping through his fingers, and there was no one left to clean up the mess. In desperation, he turned to Sarah. He showed up unannounced at the house one evening, looking far less put together than usual. His tie was crooked, his hair disheveled, and there was a wildness in his eyes that Sarah had never seen before. "We need to talk," he said, standing on the porch as rain drizzled behind him. Sarah hesitated for a moment before stepping aside. She wasn't afraid of him. She was ready for whatever he had to say. Daniel paced the living room like a trapped animal, running his hands through his hair. "Look, I know I messed up," he began, his voice hoarse. "But I can fix this. We can fix this." Sarah crossed her arms, her gaze steady. "Fix what, Daniel? The marriage you destroyed? The lies you told? Or the money you stole?" Daniel froze, his face pale. "You don't understand," he said. "I didn't steal anything. I was just reallocating funds. It was for us, Sarah. For our future." Sarah laughed bitterly. "For our future, don't insult me. Those funds were for you and your double life. Don't act like you were thinking about anyone but yourself." Daniel took a step toward her, his expression desperate. "I made mistakes, okay? But I'm still the man you married. I'm still the man who loves you." "No, you're not," Sarah said, her voice trembling with anger. "The man I married was honest. He respected me. Whoever you are now, I don't know you, and I don't want to." Daniel's shoulders slumped, but his eyes still held a glimmer of defiance. "You think you're better off without me?" he asked, his tone turning bitter. "You think you can handle everything on your own?" Sarah met his gaze without flinching. "I know I can." For a moment they stood there in silence, the air thick with tension. Then, without another word, Daniel turned and walked out the door, slamming it behind him. The next morning, Sarah received a call from Claudia. "You're going to want to hear this," she said. Claudia explained that during the company's internal audit, they had discovered evidence of Daniel's mismanagement. There were funds missing, contracts falsified, and a trail of shady business deals that led directly back to him. "I've already reported it to the authorities," Claudia said. "It's out of my hands now." Sarah felt a strange mix of emotions. Part of her was relieved that Daniel was finally being held accountable, but another part of her, one she didn't want to admit, felt a pang of sadness. This was the man she had once loved, the man she had built her life with, and now his world was falling apart. The fallout came quickly. Daniel was served with legal papers the following day, notifying him of the charges against him. His assets were frozen, his reputation shattered. The media caught wind of the scandal, and soon, his name was splashed across headlines: real estate mogul, accused of fraud and embezzlement. Sarah watched the coverage from her living room, her emotions a tangled mess. This wasn't how she had envisioned her life turning out, but as she turned off the TV, she reminded herself that this wasn't her fault. Daniel had made his choices, and now he was paying the price. The final turning point came during the divorce proceedings. Sarah sat across from Daniel in the conference room, their lawyers flanking them on either side. Linda had prepared her well, and Sarah felt a sense of calm as she faced her soon-to-be ex-husband. Daniel, on the other hand, looked like a shadow of his former self. His suit hung loosely on his frame, and the confident smirk he once wore was nowhere to be found. The negotiations were tense, but Sarah held her ground. She had spent years being the accommodating wife, the one who compromised and put others first. Not anymore. In the end, Sarah walked away with everything she deserved: the house, the majority of their joint assets, and the satisfaction of knowing she had stood up for herself. As she left the conference room, Linda turned to her with a small smile. "You did good, Sarah," she said. "You fought for yourself, and you won." Sarah nodded, a sense of pride washing over her. For the first time in a long time, she felt truly free. The climax of Sarah's journey wasn't just about Daniel's downfall. It was about her rise. She had faced the betrayal head-on, confronted the man who had wronged her, and emerged stronger than ever. It wasn't the life she had planned, but it was a life she could finally call her own. Sarah sat in her car, gripping the steering wheel with both hands as she stared at the building in front of her. It was Daniel's office, a sleek, modern structure that had once symbolized his ambition and success. Now, it was just another stage for his downfall. She knew he was inside, likely scrambling to salvage whatever was left of his career, but she wasn't here to see him. Not yet. Claudia had asked Sarah to meet her in the boardroom, and Sarah trusted that whatever was about to happen, it would be worth the confrontation. She straightened her blazer, took a deep breath, and stepped out of the car, her heels clicking against the pavement with purpose. This was it, the moment she reclaimed her narrative. Inside, the tension was palpable. The receptionist gave Sarah a nervous smile, clearly aware of the storm brewing behind the closed doors of the conference room. Sarah didn't bother to return the smile. She was here on a mission. Claudia greeted her with a firm handshake, her expression unreadable. "Thank you for coming," she said. "I thought it was important for you to be here." Sarah nodded, following Claudia into the boardroom. The space was filled with executives, all of them murmuring quietly as they flipped through stacks of documents. At the head of the table sat Daniel, his face pale and his jaw clenched. He looked up as Sarah entered, his eyes narrowing with a mix of anger and fear. "What is she doing here?" he demanded, his voice sharp. "She's here because she deserves to be," Claudia replied coolly. "After all, this concerns her as much as it concerns us." Daniel glared at Claudia, but said nothing. His confidence, the same confidence that had once been his greatest asset, was gone, replaced by a simmering resentment that only made him look smaller. Claudia took her seat at the head of the table and began laying out the findings of the internal audit. The room fell silent as she detailed Daniel's mismanagement of funds, his misuse of company resources, and his blatant attempts to cover his tracks. Each revelation was another nail in the coffin of his career, and Sarah watched as the executives around the table exchanged pointed glances. "You've put this entire company at risk," Claudia said, her voice steady, but laced with anger. "Your actions have not only jeopardized our financial stability, but also our reputation, and I, for one, will not stand for it." Daniel tried to protest, his voice rising in desperation. "This is a misunderstanding I can explain." But Claudia cut him off. "Don't bother. The evidence speaks for itself." Sarah couldn't help but feel a flicker of satisfaction as she watched Daniel squirm. For years, he had built his success on lies, manipulation, and arrogance. Now, it was all crumbling around him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. After the meeting, Claudia pulled Sarah aside. "I wanted you to see that," she said. "I wanted you to know that he's finally being held accountable." "Thank you," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside her. "It means more than you know." Claudia nodded. "You're stronger than you think, Sarah. Don't forget that." As Sarah walked out of the building, she felt an unfamiliar sense of closure. Daniel's empire was falling apart. And for the first time in weeks, she didn't feel like a victim. She felt like a survivor. That evening, Sarah returned home to find a letter waiting for her on the kitchen counter. It was from Daniel, his handwriting messy and rushed as though he had written it in a panic. "Sarah, I know I've made mistakes, more than I can count, and I know I've hurt you in ways I can never take back, but I need you to understand that everything I did, because I thought it would make things better for us. I thought I was building a future for us, for our family. I see now that I was wrong. I lost sight of what really mattered, and in the process, I lost you. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't expect anything from you. But I want you to know that I'm sorry for everything." Sarah stared at the letter, her emotions a tangled mess. Part of her wanted to believe him, to see this as a genuine attempt at redemption. But another part of her, the part that had been burned too many times, knew better. Daniel's apology might have been sincere, but it didn't change what he had done. It didn't undo the lies, the betrayal, or the pain he had caused. She folded the letter and placed it in a drawer, unsure if she would ever read it again. The next morning, Sarah met with Linda to finalize the divorce proceedings. The two of them sat across from each other in Linda's office, the sound of papers shuffling filling the air. "Are you sure about this?" Linda asked, her tone gentle but firm. "Once you sign these, there's no going back." Sarah nodded without hesitation. "I'm sure it's time to move on." Linda handed her the pen, and Sarah signed the documents with a steady hand. It was the final step in a long, painful journey, and as she set the pen down, she felt an overwhelming sense of relief. "It's done," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Linda smiled. "Yes, it is, and now you can start the next chapter." That evening, Sarah invited Rachel over for dinner. The two of them sat on the patio, sipping wine as the sun set behind the trees. Max lay at their feet, his tail wagging lazily as he basked in the warmth of their laughter. "You did it," Rachel said, raising her glass in a toast. "You survived." Sarah smiled, clinking her glass against Rachel's. "I did, and I'm stronger for it." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the weight of the past few weeks finally beginning to lift. Sarah knew there was still healing to be done, but for the first time in a long time, she felt hopeful about the future. "Here's to new beginnings," she said, her voice filled with quiet determination. "To new beginnings," Rachel agreed, her smile warm and genuine. The climax of Sarah's story wasn't just about Daniel's downfall. It was about her rise. She had faced the betrayal head-on, taken control of her life, and emerged stronger than ever. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. As she sat on the patio, watching the stars begin to appear in the night sky, Sarah felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. This was her life now, her story, and she was ready to write the next chapter. Sarah stood in her living room, staring at the framed photos on the mantelpiece. They felt like relics from another life, a life where she believed in the man she had married. Her fingers hovered over a picture of her and Daniel on their wedding day. She was beaming in the photo, her white dress glowing in the sunlight, while Daniel stood beside her, his smile full of charm. It was the smile of a man who could convince anyone of anything, the smile of a liar. She pulled the photo from the frame and tucked it into a drawer, leaving the empty space as a reminder of the life she was choosing to leave behind. The divorce papers were finalized, but Sarah knew the real battle wasn't over yet. Daniel had been too quiet, too compliant during the proceedings. She had a nagging feeling that he wasn't finished trying to manipulate the situation to his advantage. Later that afternoon, Sarah received a call from Linda, her lawyer. "We've hit a snag," Linda said. her voice tight with frustration. "Daniel's legal team is claiming you exaggerated the financial discrepancies. They're trying to pin part of the blame on you." Sarah felt a wave of anger surge through her. "Me? Are they serious?" "They're desperate," Linda replied. "And Daniel's team knows the only way to mitigate the damage to his reputation is to paint you as complicit. Don't worry. We've got this. But I wanted you to be prepared." Sarah clenched her fists, the familiar sting of betrayal settling in her chest. "Thanks for letting me know I'm ready for whatever they throw at me." Meanwhile, Daniel was in full damage control mode. His financial empire was crumbling. His business partners were distancing themselves, and Claudia had taken full control of their company. Daniel's usual smooth-talking charm was useless against the mountain of evidence piling up against him. But Daniel wasn't the type to go down without a fight. He arranged a meeting with his closest confidant, someone who had helped him clean up messes in the past. Together, they concocted a plan to shift the narrative, one that would absolve Daniel of his wrongdoings and shift the focus onto Sarah. If he couldn't salvage his business reputation, he could at least take her down with him. The next morning, a news article surfaced online. The headline read, "Messy Divorce. Sarah Carter accused of fabricating evidence against husband." The article painted Sarah as a scorned woman who had resorted to deception to win her divorce settlement. It cited anonymous sources who claimed Sarah had manipulated financial records and falsified emails. Sarah's phone exploded with messages as soon as the article went live. Friends and colleagues reached out with words of support, but there were also whispers of doubt. Sarah knew how damaging public perception could be, especially in her line of work. Her reputation as a respected interior designer was built on trust, and now, Daniel was trying to destroy that. Sarah didn't waste any time. She called Linda, who was already on top of the situation. "We're issuing a formal statement," Linda said, "and I've got a private investigator looking into the source of that article. It's clear Daniel's behind this, but we need concrete proof." Sarah nodded, even though Linda couldn't see her. "I'm not letting him win," she said firmly. "Not this time." That evening, Sarah sat down with Rachel, her best friend and unwavering ally. The two of them had spent countless nights strategizing over wine and takeout, and tonight was no different. "You need to hit back," Rachel said, her voice filled with determination. "Daniel's trying to ruin your life, and you can't just sit here and let him." "I know," Sarah replied, staring at the news article on her laptop. "But I don't want to stoop to his level." "It's not stooping," Rachel argued. "It's fighting back. He's playing dirty, and you have every right to defend yourself." Sarah sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I just want this to be over." "And it will be," Rachel said, placing a reassuring hand on Sarah's arm. "But you have to keep fighting. You've come too far to back down now." The following week was a whirlwind of action. Linda's private investigator uncovered a direct link between Daniel and the journalist who had written the article. Armed with this information, Linda filed a defamation suit against Daniel, accusing him of orchestrating a smear campaign against Sarah. The case garnered media attention, and soon, the tide began to turn. Sarah's statement, calm, collected, and full of undeniable truth, resonated with people. Her reputation as a strong, independent woman who had stood up to her manipulative ex-husband began to overshadow the lies Daniel had tried to spread. But Daniel wasn't finished yet. One evening, as Sarah was locking up her office, she noticed a familiar figure standing by her car. It was Daniel. He looked disheveled, his once polished appearance replaced by a man who had clearly been unraveling. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low and desperate. Sarah hesitated, her heart pounding. "There's nothing left to say, Daniel." "Please," he said, stepping closer. "I just want to make things right." Sarah's anger flared. "Make things right after everything you've done. You tried to ruin my life, Daniel. You tried to destroy my reputation, just like you destroyed our marriage." Daniel's shoulders slumped, and for a moment, he looked genuinely remorseful. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," he said. "I was angry, and I wasn't thinking clearly, but I've lost everything, Sarah. The company, my reputation, everything, and I know it's my fault." Sarah stared at him, her emotions swirling. She wanted to believe him, to believe that he was finally taking responsibility for his actions, but she couldn't forget the months of lies, manipulation, and betrayal. You didn't just lose everything, she said quietly. You threw it away, and now, you're finally facing the consequences. Daniel nodded slowly, his eyes filled with regret. I'm sorry, he said. For everything. For the first time in months, Sarah felt a sense of closure. She didn't know if Daniel's apology was genuine, and honestly, it didn't matter. She wasn't looking for validation from him anymore. She had found her strength in herself. Without another word, Sarah got into her car and drove away, leaving Daniel standing alone in the parking lot. That night, as Sarah sat on her patio with Max at her feet, she reflected on everything she had been through. The betrayal, the heartbreak, the fight for her freedom. It had been a long, painful journey, but she had come out stronger on the other side. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. She was finally free. Free from the lies, free from the pain, and free to live life on her own terms. The days after Sarah's final confrontation with Daniel were quiet, almost unnervingly so. The chaos that had consumed her life for months had suddenly subsided, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she was living in a battlefield. The smear article was retracted with a formal apology. Linda had ensured the defamation suit worked in Sarah's favor, and Daniel had finally disappeared from her life. He hadn't tried to fight the lawsuit. Whether it was shame, exhaustion, or simply the realization that he had nothing left to lose, Daniel signed a settlement, agreeing to drop all accusations against Sarah. His career was over. His empire was in ruins. Claudia had completely taken over the company, cleaning up the mess Daniel had left behind. The man who once ruled over his world with arrogance and charm now found himself alone, powerless, and irrelevant. Sarah didn't take pleasure in Daniel's downfall, at least not the way she thought she might. Watching him crumble wasn't as satisfying as standing tall after everything he'd put her through, because in the end, his failure wasn't her victory. Her victory was something much bigger. It was reclaiming her life. 1 month later, the house was quiet, as Sarah finished packing the last of her things. She had made the decision to sell it, a house that had once felt like a dream, but had become a symbol of pain. Fresh starts, she realized, often require letting go of the past completely. Rachel arrived with coffee and a big smile, ready to help. Are you sure about this? She asked, watching Sarah tape up another box. I've never been more sure, Sarah replied, her tone light but confident. This house holds too many ghosts. I need a change. Rachel grinned. Well, wherever you end up, Max and I are just a call away. Sarah laughed as Max wagged his tail at the sound of his name. You'd better be. I'll need someone to bring wine and keep me company when the walls start feeling too empty. The two friends loaded the last of the boxes into the moving truck, and as Sarah stood in the driveway looking at the house, she felt nothing. No sadness, no nostalgia, just relief. She had thought this moment might bring tears, but instead, it brought peace. This isn't the end of anything, Rachel said quietly beside her. It's the beginning. Sarah smiled, her gaze shifting toward the horizon. Exactly. Sarah moved into a cozy apartment across town, a smaller space, but one filled with warmth and light. She decorated it exactly how she wanted, filling it with plants, artwork, and personal touches she never would have allowed herself to indulge in before. It was hers, completely hers. A place that felt like home for the first time in years. Her work flourished, too. The fallout from Daniel's smear campaign had only made her stronger. Clients, colleagues, and even strangers admired her strength and resilience. You handled that with so much grace, one client told her during a consultation. You showed us all how to stand tall after falling. Sarah didn't feel like a hero. She still had her bad days, the nights when doubt crept in and memories resurfaced. But every time she looked at the life she was rebuilding for herself, she knew she had done the right thing. 6 months later, on a quiet Saturday morning, Sarah sat on her balcony with Max curled up at her feet and a mug of coffee in her hands. She scrolled through her emails, pausing when she saw a message from an unfamiliar name. Subject: an apology. It was from Daniel. Sarah hesitated, her finger hovering over the screen. She didn't owe him anything, not forgiveness, not closure. But after a moment, curiosity won. She opened the email. Sarah, I know you don't want to hear from me, and I don't blame you. I've spent the last few months trying to figure out how everything went so wrong, and the truth is, I have no one to blame but myself. I let my pride, my greed, and my ego destroy everything that mattered. You deserved better. So much better. I'm sorry for the lies, for the betrayal, for everything I put you through. I don't expect forgiveness, but I hope one day you'll be able to remember the good parts of us. If not for me, then for yourself. I hope you're happy now. You deserve to be. Daniel Sarah read the email twice before closing it. She didn't feel anger or sadness, just a quiet acceptance. Daniel's words didn't change anything, and they didn't erase the pain he had caused. But in a strange way, they felt like a final chapter, one she was ready to close. She leaned back in her chair, breathing in the cool morning air as the sun rose higher in the sky. The woman she had been a year ago wouldn't have recognized the woman she was now, stronger, wiser, and finally at peace. Over the next few months, Sarah embraced her new life. She traveled more, took on projects that excited her, and even started painting again, something she hadn't done since college. The scars Daniel left behind were still there, but they no longer defined her. They were reminders of what she had overcome. One evening, as she hosted a small dinner party with friends, Rachel raised her glass for a toast. "To Sarah," she said, her voice full of pride. "For proving that endings aren't always tragedies. They're opportunities to start again." "To Sarah," the others echoed, clinking their glasses. Sarah smiled, feeling a warmth she hadn't known in years. The story of Sarah's life wasn't over. It was just beginning. She had faced betrayal, heartbreak, and loss, but she hadn't let it break her. Instead, she had used it to rebuild herself into someone stronger, someone unstoppable. And as she sat on her balcony that night, watching the stars shimmer in the dark sky, Sarah knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. Her story wasn't about the man who betrayed her. It was about the woman who found herself again. And that's where Sarah's journey ends, for now. Let us know in the comments what you think of her story. Have you ever faced a moment like Sarah's? How did you find your strength to rise above it? Don't forget to hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs a little inspiration today, and subscribe to our channel for more stories like this one. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time. This wraps up the story with closure, growth, and a hopeful note. Let me know if there's anything else you'd like to refine.